Errors, unfortunately, we all make them. It's just an element of life. And as designers, they're important characteristics for us to think about when we are designing our applications. And that also extends to when we are measuring usability. So why might we have a look at the errors that the user makes, both in terms of classifying them and counting them? There's a range of different reasons why we could do that. One of the reasons is that the actual errors that the user make, they tend to be the most significant elements that result in task failure. And we always want our tasks to succeed, so working out why they don't succeed, that gives us an indication of what we may need to change. They can also help us identify where there may be underlying usability issues, depending on the type of error that has occurred, or indeed where there's a mismatch between the conceptual model and the user's mental model. So they provide useful insight then into issues that arise. We can also complement it with other types of metric in terms of time on task and task success to get a richer indication then of how users are performing. Generally, there's a couple of key conditions under which we do normally want to identify and to look for and to measure and to classify errors. And they are where an error is going to result in a significant reduction in efficiency. Some errors are quite minor and we may want to get them sort of refined out of the system. Other errors can be quite significant and really trip up the user. And if something is likely then to force the user to redo a whole series of steps, that's quite a significant impact. Those types of errors we should look for. And also errors that result in task failure or have significant negative consequences. So if that results in the task not happening, or if it results in some outcome that the user may not at all desire, then again, they're significant errors that we should specifically identify and then try to address. In terms of what makes an error then, and this is really a very, very open question, but that there are lots of different reasons why errors may arise. And you see some of the common ways that may happen on the screen. So for example, the user might enter incorrect data into a field. They may make the wrong choice from a menu or a dialogue. And again, that assumes then that we, in these both cases, we know what the notional correct is depending on the task that the user is doing. They may also follow an incorrect sequence of actions in terms of things in the wrong order or out of sequence or missing some elements. Or they may, again, related to that, fail to make a particular action, so they omit something along the way. So they're all things in terms of admissions, additions, incorrect selections, incorrect input that can result in erroneous outcome. Now, bit at the bottom, obviously which actions are erroneous depends upon the task, and that's a key element then, that when we're measuring errors, we are measuring errors that occur whilst the user is performing a particular defined action, and that's really quite important. In terms of collecting and measuring errors, this in some cases can be straightforward, in some cases it can be a lot more difficult, because we have to then be able to classify and measure and identify the actions that the user are taking for us to be able then to label some as wrong or inappropriate or omitted and so on. And for some tasks, we may have a very, very large number of potential errors that the user could introduce. If you have a form, there may be again a number of key fields that have to be filled in. There may be various types of data validation that apply to those individual forms. Taken together, you may have a very large number of potential errors that could be introduced. However, this then ties into our previous slide that we really want to initially focus on the errors that we consider to be of significance in terms of impacting on efficiency or in terms of resulting in task failure or having unattended and unwelcome consequences. We can and typically do measure the number of errors by task. So we may say to the user, okay, for this particular task, here's off you go and do that. We may identify a number of steps the user has to go through, and we could then count errors relative to those particular steps. User may go through performing 0 errors, all worked fine, up until some defined maximum that we've identified. When we're analysing and presenting errors, again, we have a couple of options here as to how we do that. They're not mutually exclusive. You can combine various ones here, and they all provide us with different ways of getting a bit of insight into the data we collect and understanding its significance. So there's 3 shown here. The first one is average errors per task, where if we have our users performing several different tasks, we then present those tasks with the number of errors that occur per task. Because the number of errors can vary between tasks, we may have one task where there may be only 3 or 4 errors. We could have another task where there's 10 potential errors. Sometimes we may just want to present it in absolute numbers. Sometimes maybe we may want to present it as a percentage of the number that could have occurred. It's just a judgment call depending on what looks to be most useful. It's also, and can be very useful, to think about the average number of errors per user, in terms of then reporting for this particular user as he or she goes through their tasks. Well, how many errors did they make on average per task? And again, that helps us understand and identify the variability that we have across our populations of users. We may find, sometimes you do, that there are a small group of users that result in a significant number of errors then being introduced. And they're quite important because it is useful then to look at those users in terms of trying to identify, are there any issues potentially around accessibility? Are there any issues potentially around a mismatch between the user's mental model and the conceptual model that we have assumed for people doing that particular task? And the final one then is to not only to count the number of errors, but to include metrics then that weigh them based upon their severity. So we might say that there was, an average of 8 errors for this particular task. 1 of them was severe, 2 of them, moderate, 4 of them with a minor, and so on. So again, that also gives us a way of further segmenting the data, potentially then identifying the elements that we focus on first of all. So that's all we want to cover at in terms of this initial foray into having a look at errors. They are useful elements then to measure, particularly as they give us good insight into where we have issues or mismatches with our design, and they give us quite often good insights then into what we need to do to improve matters. We're going to go on this to the next section. We're going to have a look at efficiency. So fundamentally, errors tie into efficiency. We want our users to be able to complete tasks in as efficient manner as they possibly can.